Sophie Wessex has been captured sharing a sweet moment with her great-nephew. The Countess of Wessex was spotted comforting Prince George at the Queen's funeral.
Imagine a palace where centuries of tradition are guarded behind locked doors, yet history can be rewritten in silence. Two women enter a room with no cameras, no staff, and no witnesses, and emerge 2 hours later having shifted the balance of power within the British monarchy forever. Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, didn't use headlines, scandals, or public drama. They used patience, strategy, and moves so precise that the king himself could not intervene. But how did two women, operating entirely in secret, manage to outmaneuver the most powerful figures in the palace? What happened in that room changed the course of royal authority and left one woman, Camilla, completely blindsided. This is the story of the quietest and most ruthless power shift in modern royal history. The gathering storm, the roots of what happened in that locked room stretch back months to a period the public remembers for a very different reason. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer.
Breaking news from Buckingham Palace, which has announced that the King has been diagnosed with cancer.
The announcement sent shockwaves through the institution. But the real turbulence was happening where no cameras could reach. Charles began withdrawing from public duties. His schedule was cut dramatically. His reliance on William grew by the week. And into that widening vacuum, Camilla moved with a speed that alarmed everyone paying attention. She began appearing in advisory meetings she had never previously attended, the same internal briefings that shape palace operations, ceremonial planning, and press strategy. Key staff members loyal to Catherine were quietly reassigned. Event protocols were rewritten under Camilla's direction. Catherine, who had only just returned to public life after her own cancer treatment in late 2024.
I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support.
A recovery the entire nation had watched with genuine concern, found herself systematically excluded from the decision-making architecture she had occupied for years. This was not oversight. This was construction. Camilla was building a power structure, brick by invisible brick, while the king was too ill to notice and too loyal to question. Sophie saw the same pattern from a different angle. For years, she had watched her contributions dismissed in meetings only to resurface weeks later under Camilla's name. Her daughter, Lady Louise, had been quietly removed from events through the kind of scheduling adjustments too small to challenge, but too consistent to ignore. The breaking point was not a single betrayal, but the accumulation of dozens. Princess Anne had been watching all of it with the patience of someone who has spent 70 years studying how power actually moves inside the monarchy. She pulled Sophie aside and delivered 5 words. "You will know when it is time." Sophie reached out to Catherine, and the door was locked behind them. Monarchy power shift. No official transcript exists of what was said in that room, and given the lengths both women went to in order to ensure total privacy, it is unlikely one ever will. But the aftermath tells us everything we need to know about what unfolded behind that locked door. Catherine did not begin with emotion. She began with evidence. Sources describe her presenting a confidential briefing assembled over weeks. A dossier mapping Camilla's expanding influence across every major function of the palace. This was not unprecedented in royal history. When Edward VIII's inner circle attempted to consolidate power during the abdication crisis of 1936, it was documentation, not confrontation, that ultimately forced the decisive shift. Catherine understood that lesson. From personnel decisions to ceremonial planning to the quiet restructuring of the king's own daily schedule, the pattern she laid out was methodical and undeniable. Camilla was not advising the crown. She was redirecting it. And the paper trail made coincidence an impossible defense. Sophie listened in silence at first, but as the evidence deepened, her composure cracked into something rawer. She spoke about years of being sidelined through the kind of quiet, institutional maneuvering that the monarchy has perfected over centuries. She recalled proposals she had developed being acknowledged with polite nods in meetings, only to resurface weeks later, repackaged under Camilla's name. She described how her daughter, Lady Louise, was gradually removed from family engagements through scheduling adjustments so minor they could never be challenged individually, much like the way Duchess Meghan later described being slowly edged out of institutional support during her time as a working royal. The method was always the same. Not open hostility, but administrative suffocation, executed so quietly that naming it made you sound paranoid rather than perceptive. In that crucible, a partnership crystallized around something more dangerous than anger: clarity. Both women recognized they were not dealing with a personality conflict, but with a structural takeover of the monarchy's internal machinery. The kind of consolidation that historically becomes permanent once it passes a critical threshold. The conversation turned practical. What mechanisms existed within the Privy Council framework and the royal household's own governance structure to limit a consort's operational authority? How far could they move without triggering a constitutional crisis? It was here that Princess Anne's name entered the discussion with the weight of someone whose endorsement transformed a grievance into a mandate. Anne had reportedly given her written blessing weeks earlier. Before they left, Catherine drafted a sealed document. Not a threat, insurance. And it made their position unassailable. The walls close. In the moment Catherine and Sophie stepped out of that room, the machinery they had set in motion began to turn. Not visibly, not dramatically, but with the kind of institutional precision that only people who truly understand how the British monarchy actually operates behind its gilded curtains know how to wield. The first sign came within hours, and it mirrored a pattern the palace has used before. When Prince Andrew was stripped of his patronages in January 2022,
it could be months before a civil lawsuit against Britain's Prince Andrew goes to trial.
The public saw a single headline. But behind the scenes, dozens of staff reassignments happened overnight, without a single memo being circulated. The same playbook was now being deployed against Camilla, her most trusted lady-in-waiting. A woman who had served at her side for over a decade was reassigned to the Sandringham estate without explanation. No announcement, no farewell. She was simply moved, and the vacancy she left behind was not filled. It was erased entirely from the palace staffing chart. Palace insiders began noticing other shifts that carried echoes of real institutional restructuring. Security rotations were quietly rewritten, the same kind of protocol adjustment that occurred in 2020 when Harry and Meghan's Windsor security detail was dissolved practically overnight after their departure from royal duties. Key personnel were no longer stationed where they had been the previous day. Routine corridors of access that Camilla had used freely for years were suddenly rerouted through additional checkpoints. In a household where every movement follows centuries of ritual, these disruptions were not accidents. They were architecture. You do not challenge power by confronting it directly. You challenge it by quietly dismantling the infrastructure that holds it up. Then came something no one had encountered before. Two senior aides were overheard outside the palace library referencing what they called the Windsor Clause, a phrase that had never appeared in any official protocol. Documents began moving through channels that bypassed Camilla's oversight entirely. A sealed package bearing the royal crest was hand-delivered by Prince Edward's personal guard directly to Catherine's private office, circumventing every handler who, would normally have processed it. The chain of command was being rewritten in real time, and Camilla could feel it before she could name it. Her instructions met friction. Her calls went unreturned. Staff who once responded with immediate deference now routed her requests through layers of approval that had not existed the day before. In a house where delay has never been accidental, delay was rebellion, and the walls were closing in. Camilla strikes back. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Camilla proved the truth of that proverb spectacularly. The moment she understood what was happening, she did not retreat into silence. She detonated. The British monarchy has seen these eruptions before. When Princess Diana gave her infamous panorama interview in 1995, the palace response was volcanic behind closed doors, even as the public face remained composed. When Meghan and Harry sat down with Oprah in 2021,
television queen Oprah Winfrey spent 2 hours digging into why Prince Harry and Meghan left royal life.
Insiders described senior royals making frantic phone calls deep into the night. But what staff witnessed from Camilla in the hours after she grasped the full scope of what had been engineered against her was described as something entirely without precedent. Files she demanded had already been reclassified. Communications she sought had been rerouted. People she called either did not answer or responded with a politeness so measured it carried its own unmistakable message. Her first strategic move was to demand an emergency audience with King Charles. She invoked her title, her proximity, her constitutional right as Queen Consort to speak with the sovereign. The request was made twice. Both times she received vague assurances, followed by silence. When the King's team finally informed her that Charles was unavailable until further notice, the rejection carried the weight of a locked gate. This mirrored a pattern the monarchy has deployed before. When Prince Andrew sought audiences with Queen Elizabeth during the height of the Epstein fallout, his requests were similarly filtered through layers of scheduling.
The British royal family, meantime, is also coming under pressure after the release of the Epstein files
That functioned as a polite but absolute wall. Camilla turned to Anne, reaching out with the language of sisterhood and shared duty. Anne's response, relayed through intermediaries, was 4 words that landed like a verdict. You have had your time. The one royal Camilla believed too loyal to turn had not only turned, but had authorized the entire operation weeks in advance. In desperation, she drafted a memorandum reaffirming her authority over ceremonial functions and staff oversight. It never made it past the private secretary's desk. A single aide marked it unendorsed and returned it without comment. Over the following 48 hours, sources described contradictory orders, erratic dismissals, and a reported phone call to Princess Beatrice that was allegedly recorded and leaked almost immediately, a call in which Camilla reportedly referred to Catherine as dangerous and accused Sophie of poisoning Anne's loyalty. Her final move was to threaten the removal of Catherine's longtime advisor. But internal protocols recently restructured under Anne's authority shielded him completely. The threat did not land. It only exposed how little power Camilla had left. The king's signature. In the stillness that followed Camilla's failed counterattack, the monarchy arrived at a threshold it could no longer avoid. Charles, weakened by weeks of declining health and emotionally hollowed by the war unfolding within his own household, was presented with a choice he had spent years trying to outrun. Catherine brought the document, the same one drafted in that locked room with Sophie, refined in the days since, supported by evidence that could not be disputed, and endorsed by the one member of the family whose judgment Charles had never questioned. She did not make demands. She did not raise her voice. She laid the facts before the king with the composure of someone who understood that this moment would define the monarchy for a generation. Prince Edward stood nearby, silent but unmistakable in his presence. His being there was not ceremonial. It was a declaration that this was not the action of one faction within the family, but a consensus that had formed across its most senior members. When Charles finished reading, he looked up. Edward met his gaze and spoke 2 words. "It is time." What followed was not a spectacle. It was a signature. A royal decree, drafted with precision and stripped of ambiguity, formally reduced Queen Consort Camilla's involvement in all palace household matters. Advisory input revoked. Staff oversight returned to the sovereign's direct authority. Ceremonial responsibilities realigned under new oversight. The document never mentioned Camilla by name. It did not need to. Everyone present understood exactly what it meant. Charles signed. He sealed the envelope and handed it to Catherine without ceremony. She accepted it with a single nod. And as she turned to leave, Charles, pale and visibly exhausted, whispered something that no one in that room expected to hear from a reigning monarch. "I cannot fight anymore." Those 4 words carried the weight of a man who understood that the institution he had inherited was now being sustained not by his authority, but by the women who had stepped into the space his weakness had created. The decree was never publicly announced. That was never the intention. Instead, it was distributed in fragments, first to senior aides, then to trusted press contacts, buried within a broader piece about palace restructuring. A whisper rather than a proclamation. But within the institution, the effect was immediate and total. Camilla's calls were filtered, her requests rerouted. Her title remained, but the authority behind it had been emptied by a single stroke of ink. The new order. In the weeks that followed, Catherine did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She simply stepped into the vacancy and began doing the work. Her signature appeared on official communications. Her name led internal briefings, schedules, ceremonial planning, family protocol. All of it now flowed through the Princess of Wales with an efficiency that echoed a transition the monarchy had seen once before. When Queen Elizabeth's health declined sharply in her final months at Balmoral in 2022, it was Anne and Charles who quietly absorbed her operational duties weeks before the public knew anything had changed. Catherine was now doing the same thing, except the person she was replacing was still alive and still living under a royal roof. Sophie operated beside her as an unofficial coordinator, reconciling departments that had been fractured by months of competing loyalties. The atmosphere inside the palace shifted from tension to clarity, from whispered suspicion to functional order. Anne's handwritten endorsement remained sealed in the royal vault, but its existence was known to everyone who needed to know. Outside the gates, public sentiment confirmed what the institution had already decided. Catherine's approval ratings surged to levels not seen since the early days of Diana's public life. Newspapers that had spent years covering her wardrobe began writing about her in the language of governance and leadership. The narrative had fundamentally changed. Camilla remained in residence. Her title was never formally revoked. She attended necessary engagements with composure, but her office was quiet, and her calls went unanswered. Meanwhile, William, working in close coordination with Catherine, had already begun preparing the next generation. A private conversation with Prince George, described as thoughtful and age-appropriate, touched on duty, tradition, and legacy. The monarchy was thinking 3 generations ahead, and Catherine was the axis on which that future turned. The palace has returned to its usual rhythm. Corridors echo with quiet footsteps, doors lock, and the world sees only ceremony and tradition. But behind the walls, the balance of power has shifted. Alliances have been redrawn, loyalties tested, and influence quietly recalibrated. And yet, the question lingers. How many more moves remain unseen? How many more battles are being fought in silence, far from the public eye, before the next storm breaks over the crown? The story is far from over. And the next chapter may be unfolding even now, where no one outside the palace will ever know, unless we look closer.